This is Growing a Revolution, Freethought Dialogue and Debate in the Secular Review and Agnostic Journal. Atheists, agnostics and secularists harness the power of periodicals as a network to challenge Victorian conventions about faith and society while sustaining and growing a radical movement. Freethought's a 19th century term that groups together different forms of secularism and also indicates the wider political and social elements of the primarily working class movement, which often overlapped with republicanism, socialism, and feminism. I'm interested in what different forms of communication can tell us about forms of belief, and in this paper I'll be focusing on how debate and dialogue shaped British Freethought discourses. I recently began a Leverhulme Fellowship on these periodicals, but would like to thank RSVP for funding it in its early stages with a current fellowship. So this slide provides an overview of the publication context, showing the periodicals that, alongside secular societies, advanced a national discussion by those who were empowered by and committed to free thought. There were three broad stages of publishing activities: the early period, 1860 to 1880, which began with a limited number of periodicals, which grew slowly; the 1880s as really the period of proliferation, and then a period of decline paired with the rise of some alternatives at the fin de siècle. This aligns with historians' accounts of the rise and fall of the organised freethought movement, key events including the founding of the National Secular Society in 1866, the rival British Secular Union appearing in 1877, Bradlaugh's election as Northampton's MP in 1880 and denial of his seat until 1886 on the basis of his atheism, and George W. Foote's trial for blasphemy in 1883, and these latter two really pushed the discussion of radical free thought into the public arena. Engagement then dissipated towards the end of the century as other social movements came to take precedence. So reading, writing for and editing these periodicals built social networks, imagined communities and feelings of shared endeavour. But the freethought movement was not built on a single homogenous platform. Factionalism and infighting were rife. Debates and dialogues therefore looked both inward and outward. And here I'm building on previous research that's considered how periodicals create dialogic spaces and also how letters and correspondence enable participation and empowerment. In this paper, I'm going to briefly consider these four dialogic forms: verbatim debate reports, which concern big questions usually like the veracity of the Bible or the definitions of atheism. And there's an important distinction to be made between oral and written culture, my interest being not in the events themselves, but in how they're rendered textually in the pages of periodicals. We have imagined formal dialogues drawing upon the Socratic method, usually functioning as ideal debates that sometimes evoke real-world conversations, but are nonetheless artificial and can also lean on straw man arguments. They nonetheless model modes of challenging received beliefs. Open columns, either styled as letters to the editor or addressed to previous contributors, provided space for opposing views. Usually prefaced with a note that the editor was not responsible for any opinions expressed, these columns enabled debate and exchange to span consecutive issues. And then we have to correspondence columns, which gesture towards dialogue while precluding it by largely omitting readers' voices and instead replacing these with responses from the editor. It's a form of dialogue that, for all except the original writers, is incomplete and therefore unfulfilled. So I'll now focus on how these forms functioned across 3 decades of a one Sunday weekly periodical. Suffice to say, the changes shown on this slide in terms of its editorship and title are indicative of its shifting foundations, most notably its transformation from the Secular Review in the 1870s to the Agnostic Journal in the 1880s. While the first few years saw the editorship change hands repeatedly, from 1884 it was solely the concern of William Stewart Ross, who published under the name Saladin until his death in 1906. Editorial pieces were significant regular features that certainly shaped reader engagement, but these always appeared in the context of myriad other voices, so the issues evoke conversations rather than grand pronouncements. If we think about periodicals' epigraphs, they may be understood to function as a statement of purpose from the editor. In this instance, they encouraged readers to challenge received ideas, propagating debate. For example, in 1877, false ideas may be refuted by argument, but only by true ideas can they be expelled, J.H. Newman. The co-option of religious writings for the epigraph often demonstrated freethinkers' charge of hypocrisy against Christianity. In 1902, this comes through in the words of St. Jerome, and more starkly in 1882's epigraph, "Let there be light, God." In using these quotations on the masthead, the editor encourages readers to reconsider the words intoned by religious adherents and think about the imperative to find truth on one's own terms rather than blindly following dogma. So verbatim reports of debates created a far larger audience for speakers' words. The format of the periodicals enabled the right to reply, ensuring that rank and file freethinkers were active members of a network of thought and action. Reports of debates were particularly a feature of the earlier years of the Secular Review while under the editorship of Watts and Foote. Both men were active on the lecture circuit, and so the appearance of such content reflects their own priorities. For example, across 8 issues in 1877, they published serialized verbatim reports of debates between each editor and George Sexton. The subjects being, is Christianity of divine origin and adapted to the wants of humanity? And is secularism the true gospel of mankind? The reports were complemented and challenged by an independent report and contributions to open columns. Sexton, a secularist turned spiritualist, responded to the report in a letter that defended his performance at the debate, to which the report author B responded robustly, though Sexton was given the last word before the editors closed the exchange down because they said it had become more personal than useful. In these extracts, there are 2 key elements that indicate how the form functioned in a periodical's context. In the verbatim report, the live experience of the debate and presence of the audience is described through the parenthetical applause and laughter, providing readers with a richer sense of what it was like to attend. The interjection from an anonymous voice, agreeing with Foote, demonstrates that it is possible for the audience to engage with those on the platform, but the chair's response, "Do not let us have any unseemly disruption," indicates how this was circumscribed. The right of reply from the audience, though, is made abundantly clear by B's letter in the open column. B writes that, as one of the audience at that debate, I had the perfect right to state my opinion respecting it. They go on to critique both the form and content of Sexton's contributions, emphasising freethinkers' expectations about debate as a codified form that must adhere to rules of content and have an openness to critique. The formal dialogues in the Secular Review use the Socratic method to work through philosophical questions. They draw on a popular tradition that may be traced back through the 19th century and earlier in science writing in particular. Apologies for the poor quality of this image, but it shows the 11th part of Joseph Taylor's serialized dialogue, Relativism, Non-Relativism, Absolutism, an exposition and a vindication of method and terminology, where the 2 speakers were the absolutist and the relativist. The installments range across phenomenalism, dogmatism, egotism, and how Christianity sits within these spectrums of belief. The artificiality of the imagined exchange is made explicit, though it is of course written to mimic natural speech, and the rules of engagement as clearly stated. You are aware that I sometimes like to moralize a little as I go. We understand each other, and there is no danger of giving offense. Such dialogues model modes of challenging opposing beliefs and provide opportunities for freethinkers to absorb debating skills and its codified practice. So while I've thus far highlighted how opposing views were published in the periodical and debate played out in good faith, the To Correspondence column reminds us that choices are still being made about whose voices are heard, both in terms of editorial decision-making and also, of course, societal contexts. I'll focus on the former here regarding this 1897 column, where I've highlighted 2 overt kinds of editorial power. First, a rejection addressed to RF, because apparently his poetry submission is too similar to Walter Scott's. And then a second that speaks to significant delays in inserting letters that have been accepted before them being published, potentially even months later, it says. Nonetheless, Ross used the To Correspondence column to make statements about his impartiality and openness as an editor. For example, considerations of personal friendship shall never induce us to suppress letters from strangers attacking the positions held by those for whom we have great personal regard. This journal is subsidized by no one and is utterly and absolutely fearless and independent. However, the absolute authority of the editor indicates that there's also no one to challenge his decision-making, which may undermine a true and Catholic spirit of inquiry that he aspires to. My discussion of the correspondence between Sexton and Bee demonstrated how letters to the editor, which filled between half a page and 2 pages of every issue, propagated debate. There it was notable that there was a theist and an atheist perspective being represented. The examples on this slide further clarify the purpose of debate and dialogue in the pages of this periodical, namely that the journal is, according to the investigator, often read by Christians. As such, they claim that dialogic forms also have the potential to convert those who are religious, but are nonetheless open to engaging with Freethought periodicals. So as the Secular Review merged into the Agnostic Journal under the editorship of Ross, it was often acknowledged that the ideal truth was unknowable. The key concerns of the periodical were to question religious orthodoxy, highlight hypocrisy, and use reason to reshape society for the better. That absolute truth might be out of reach did not, however, mean that it was not worth debating all manner of subjects to achieve a better understanding of them. Periodicals such as this therefore provided a space for freethinkers to hone their arguments as spectators and participants in debates in textual space. Foregrounding dialogic forms sought to equip readers and writers to forge a more equitable, circular society grounded in equality and political participation. The heterogeneity of Freethought communities is thus emphasized, shaping shared revolutionary discourses while maintaining an awareness of the power of disagreement.